I'm a professor here at the University of Chicago, where I also run the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. And I'm really excited to be able to share with you tonight a project that grew out of one of our flagship programs, which is our summer data journalism program. And how this works is we invite proposals from professional journalists working here in Chicago, proposals for data-intensive projects that they would not be able to complete on their own. And then we assemble teams of students and faculty who work intensively on those projects over the course of the summer. We deliver them to the journalists results and data and code and visualizations and all kinds of great stuff that they can use in their stories. And then we also try to produce products for the public and also some offshoots that we can use for our own academic research. So I want to talk to you about the first of our projects to come out of this past summer. And we're going to ask our data journalism fellow, Sarah Freistadt from the Tribune, to come and tell us how she was motivated to do this project and get us started. Sarah.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Sarah. I am a reporter at the Tribune. I cover transit. So obviously this is of huge interest to me. And I can start out by telling you guys a little bit about the questions I had, the interest I had, and the complete lack of data skills I had to tackle any of it. So how all this happened. So yeah, I guess if you think back to 2024, early 2024, early last year, we all I think a lot of us had a lot of questions about transit, like what was going on and why wasn't it really working. We were like really out of the depths of the pandemic, but bus and train service wasn't back to where we wanted it to be, maybe where a lot of us expected it to be. And I was really interested in digging into that a little bit more. So I had kind of three big topics that I wanted to try to dive into and see if I could figure out. The first was how much had transit service actually changed during the pandemic? We knew it wasn't as good. We didn't quite know how much. Kind of digging into that, quantifying it was a little bit hard. The second layer of that was I was really interested in figuring out how the experience of riding transit was different in different parts of the city. We know a lot of things in Chicago, where you live really affects how you experience parts of the city. And I was really, really curious, okay, I live on the Northwest side, so I know what it's like for me to ride a bus and ride a train, but what if you're a student here at U Chicago? What if you live on the far south side? How is service kind of playing out across the city? And then the third element of this is, I am a journalist, so we're always interested in accountability. And something that CTA was saying a lot at the time was they were very focused on equity and ensuring equitable transit access across the city. Even though they were having a lot of challenges running service, they wanted to make sure that there was still access across the city. And so I was very curious if that was what was actually happening. So, I wanted to think about all these questions, wanted to answer all these questions. I'd seen a lot of work out there about trains. I had actually done some analysis on trains. The trains are a little bit easier to manage. But the buses were, I felt where the kind of heart of the issue was, but they were really hard to tackle. So more people ride buses than trains in the city. The buses go more places. The buses are really kind of the backbone of the transit system. But for me, with almost no data skills, it's really, really almost impossible to dig into them. There's 127 or thereabouts bus routes. They go all over the city. If you were to pull out an individual bus route, what's happening at one end of the city might not be what's happening at the other end of the city. And then of course, just if anyone rides a bus, that, if one bus route that you normally take is messed up one day, there's probably 4 other buses that will get you generally in the same direction. So how do you figure out how all the bus routes play together, tie geography into that? Those were a lot of the challenges in trying to dive into that. And that is where you guys came in to try to help make sense of what was going on and the lay of the land. And I will hand it over to you guys to the chat.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, after Sarah came in as a journalist and we were assigned to her project, we wanted to see what was going to be the first, like the data sources that we could access. And basically what we discovered is that there's like one project that came off from actually Chai Hack Night, right? We had like two things. We first had the CTA API. So the Chicago Transit Authority actually provides you with access to their data through an API. So if we were to query that API at the moment, we could get the real live location of every bus in Chicago at the moment, right? So that's a bunch of information that we get access through the API. But then the challenge is that the CTA does not provide you access to the past, right? So we will need to run our own queries to try to make an archive, but since it was already the summer and we wanted to be able to look back to COVID, we use the archive built by the Ghost Buses project that came from Chai, right? So basically, the Ghost Bus project had this archive that was being built since May 20 of 2022. So they had data that was of interest for us, and they were taking snapshots of the real life location every 5 minutes. So we use that data, but then we had another problem, right? We had to check, we have access to information. It seems like we can answer some of the questions that Sarah was interested in tackling, but the thing is that we were interested in bus service, right? How was people served? And we had actual location of every bus, but the bus could be in the middle of the street, right? The bus could be like maybe just in traffic. So we wanted to be able to translate that information into something that made more sense to how people interact with their buses. So what we wanted is to have information of when the bus was at a bus stop, right? So you're waiting, you're a user, and that's when you are like wondering, is the bus is going to show up? Maybe you're like running late. So we wanted to have that, but it was not precisely the information that was archived from the API. So the next challenge for us was to take a lot of information and a lot of different formats and convert it into what we wanted. So we had 130 million pings, right? Bus pings of real-time location. We also have more than 900 possible patterns, and this is where we started like getting to know the terminology around the CTA data, right? So there are like routes, and routes are broken into patterns, and then there are those like trips. So we had to make sense of how can we fit these points into patterns. And we also had the shapefile of the bus stops. So there are more than 10,000 bus stops in the city of Chicago. So we needed to be able to merge all of this into a sensible data set. And that entail a lot of challenges, right? So combine collection of points to identify when one trip happened, then find which route and pattern, which route and pattern belong to each trip, and then determine when a bus arrived at a bus stop. And now my colleague Joseph is going to walk us through the time imputation process that was really the most technical part that we had to surmount at the beginning of the summer.
Yes, thank you, Regina, for that. So to go into this challenge of finding the exact time a bus arrived at a stop, we first used the real-time bus locations of the buses from Shy Hack Night's Ghost Bus Scraper, which tracks the bus every 5 minutes. So shown here, we have the bus ping in red, revealing where the buses are in real time along their route. So in the next slide, we also have every bus stop in the city in which we overlay both the bus pings and the stops along a given route. So in the next slide, you can see here how we use linear interpolation within a segment of 2 live bus locations, since those are known, and then using the time and distance differences to calculate the exact time the bus was at each stop. And here you can see in the next slide, an example of what this would look like along for a route where the bus stop times are within the interval of 2 bus pings. And we have a more in-depth visualization of this for exactly how it was calculated if we want to get into that later. And then here exactly is essentially what the output of our linear interpolation would look like for a single trip, which has both the combined bus pings in red as well as the bus stops in green. And we then collect data in this format for every existing trip to then use to aggregate our metrics and incorporate for our analysis.
Thank you, Joseph. As you can see, 5 minutes seems like a short period of time, right? So we see the red dots and that's the snapshots that were in the archive, but you can see that there are actually a lot of bus stops between those two snapshots. So there was a lot of interpolation that we had to then like expand the data set. So we finally have like all of the inputs, the real-time bus location, the route and bus stops shape files, and the historic and current schedules, because again, we were trying to measure performance. So we had information on what was the time that the bus was supposed to be at a bus stop. So we wanted to compare against that. And we also need to see at archivals of schedules, because again, the CTA will give you the most current information. So you can have the actual schedules as of today, but you don't see the past ones. So we also have like a third-party vendor that grants us access to that. And we transformed that into an actual and scheduled time at each bus stop. So we literally knew when every bus stopped at every bus stop in the city for the last 2 years, now 2.5 years. And that has transformed from 130 pings into more than 800 million rows in our data. And with that data set, we were then able to perform the analysis and now be able to answer the questions that started the project, right? So we produce a bus report card that is basically a platform that you can go online and just like play with the statistics and see our data at different levels. A temporal analysis to see how the service changed over time, and more metrics. And there was like a bunch of things, a bunch of stuff that we did, because then it was like, how do you actually measure performance? How do you make this measurable, right? So you have the timestamps, but how do you transform that into an assessment of how the service is being provided? So some of the measures of service quality that we computed include just the time until next bus. How long do you have to wait at your bus stop? The number of buses that actually go through your bus stop, the trip duration, also the bus stop land coverage. Literally, if you see like how we created like a buffer for each bus stop and just wanted to see how long will you need to walk to get to a bus stop, right? How far or how much land coverage is in your neighborhood. We also had like this kind of busability to try to measure accessibility. And finally, there were a bunch of measurements around wait time predictability. And just to show you an example of the type of metrics of analysis that we did, this is the busability maps. So we took a neighborhood, right? This is outlined by the red dots. So we are comparing just Lincoln Park and Oakland, and we have this for every community in Chicago, right? And we just like try to plot where can you get in a single bus, right? How far can you get, and more or less how long it will take you to get there. So this is just like an example of the metrics that we did. And now we can jump into the analysis and the story of the discovery. So yes, a ton of data, a ton of really helpful data. And then comes my job, which is to take all of this data and like say something with it. So kind of conveniently, right as you guys were wrapping up all of the data analysis, CTA started making a really big deal about how bus service was on track to return to pre-pandemic levels by the end of the year. So that was kind of an interesting little peg to start looking into. That got my like hackles up, my interest peaked. So out of all of this like great, data analysis that you guys did, you ended up with really a data set that was actually like very easy for somebody like me to understand, which was just a list of the median wait times between buses. So like how often, you would typically be waiting for a bus in each neighborhood of the city by month from 2022 through 2024. So I took that and ended up comparing November of 2022 to November of 2024. To try to see how have the bus schedules changed during that time, but quantifying it in a way that like actually means something to you as a rider, right? So you're not just looking at like
here's how the schedule has changed on this one route at this one stop that's close to my house. It's actually like, okay, I ride the bus frequently. I walk out my front door and I check my bus tracker and like, oh, my normal bus is delayed, but there's a bus 2 blocks over. I'm going to take that one instead because it's coming. So how to like kind of quantify all of that. This data set allowed us to do that. So, so we had November 2022 to November 2024. You know, that also gave us a kind of interesting snapshot because 2022 was right before CTA started cutting schedules. So even though service was like not so good at that time, the schedules hadn't changed yet, which gave us a really interesting way to kind of look at like how much did CTA actually cut service over time. And then, you know, we also looked at, for this particular story, we looked at schedules, not the actual service, although you guys had put together both, really just as a way to like, first of all, account for these kind of weird variables that can affect service, like, you know, construction or like summer events or things that can cause a bus to you know, run off course, but that are not really within CTA's control. And also because the schedules kind of reflect CTA's intention, right? If you think of this as like an accountability kind of focus and like we're interested in where CTA is running buses, how they're running buses, well, the schedules show their plans, which kind of gets at their intentions. So, right, so looking at, you know, changes in schedules across various parts of the city. We ended up with, if you can go to the next slide, we ended up with, you know, a list of the neighborhoods where the waits for the bus were typically still pretty high in November 2024. And at this point, CTA says they're at like 98% of pre-pandemic bus service. So you'd expect things to be pretty close. But there were actually a bunch of neighborhoods where service had not yet returned. So, you know, there were, I think, about a little over half of neighborhoods where service had returned, a small handful of neighborhoods where service was actually better, where you were waiting less time for the bus. But then these neighborhoods where the time you'd be waiting for a bus was still really high. And so I actually took that out of curiosity and compared it to some demographic trends, specifically like median income and unemployment rate, using the city publishes something called the Chicago Health Atlas. So using that data to see what unemployment and incomes were like in these neighborhoods where bus service had not come back very quickly. And you might not be surprised to find that, or surprised to hear that it turns out a lot of these neighborhoods had higher than kind of the citywide average unemployment, lower income. You know, certainly not all of them. You can see a neighborhood like North Center on the list. That's a very wealthy neighborhood, but just kind of pulling out this broad trend. That actually does make a difference because, you know, transit, I think there's a thought in the transit world, and CTA has said themselves that neighborhoods with higher unemployment and lower income are actually like prime for prioritizing transit service because transit can connect people to jobs, can connect people to opportunity. And these are things that CTA is saying themselves. So, you know, that was kind of a reason to look into these demographic trends. But, you know, are they putting their money where their mouth is always the question. So, yeah, so these are the neighborhoods that we kind of found. And then, of course, I take, I do what I do as a journalist. I take this and I, you know, try to talk to neighborhood residents, kind of experts, thinkers, put it all into context. You know, I spent some time hanging out. I spent a lot of time hanging out at bus stops, talking to like community leaders. If anyone is familiar with Daly's restaurant in Woodlawn, I got some coffee and hung out there for a while and talked to employees and people, and just to learn like, right, we have the numbers, but what does it all actually mean if you live in these neighborhoods? What is it like? And so pulled all of that together. It was interesting. I also did ask CTA, of course, for their thoughts on this. And they told me that they just measure bus service a different way, was kind of what they said, which is perfectly fine. But I thought it was a very interesting, it put this project into some interesting context because, they measure bus service essentially by route. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's kind of the rough overview of what they do. And as we're sitting here, the whole premise of this project is to understand what it's actually like to ride the bus. And so it kind of made it seem really interesting that they didn't have a metric to do that. And this is a very useful way to capture that. So I think, so one limitation of any news story, including this one, is that it was just a snapshot in time. Right? We published a story in December. This data was through November, and we know that things are constantly changing. And CTA just announced changes to their bus service yesterday. So I think you guys came back in and created a way to continue to measure this, which I will now let you guys talk about.
Yeah, so as Sarah was saying, I think we did a lot of this work to process this existing data, but really wanted to think about how do we think about the story going forward, not just historically, but be able to kind of understand metrics in real time as things change and be able to see change in services and immediately understand where that's happening and why. And so what came out of this project is we have some ongoing things that are available that we'll talk about in terms of things that you can play with and touch and dig into, as well as some questions that thought were really interesting but didn't have time to dig into and would love for some other folks to kind of take up some of the work. So we have kind of three big things happening right now. We have an ongoing data pipeline that runs daily. And so this is continuing to grab snapshots every 5 minutes of all the buses and running this pipeline to process them, as Rahina was saying, into bus stop data, and then updating metrics so that we have ongoing metrics daily to be able to understand service as data comes in. We have some of reporting and some additional analysis we did and a full report as well that kind of looks at some of these metrics and some of these bigger stories and really dives into the methodology to see how we did all of that. And so what comes out of all of the report on the pipeline is there's the historic bus location. So if you want to just download the snapshot of the data from CTA, but altogether for daily, you can do that. If you want to be able to grab all of our process data that converts that to when the buses were at the bus stops, you can grab all of that. Or if you just want the summary metrics, all of this is published and updated daily for people to grab and play with. And the maybe more exciting thing is our online dashboard that we're calling a bus report card that Joseph will kind of give you a little demo of or a little chat through right now.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. So the inspiration for the bus report cards is essentially a way for transit users or really anyone interested to have access to our aggregated metrics in real time and explore their own bus stop, their route or community area. And on the most basic level, the user has the ability to navigate from city to community to bus stop and route in one click. So this is like the basic function of the bus report card, showing how the user would interact with the dynamic interface, going from the general region of Chicago to their community area, bus route, and a bus stop and their bus route, and being able to view all of the different aggregation metrics.
Great. So this ongoing, this dashboard has kind of a subset of some of the metrics that we thought were kind of those interesting, but there's a lot more that exist in the data set that we're providing. This is kind of a quick overview, a simplified version of the pipeline that we have running, kind of going back to this earlier conversation of these data sources coming, some from the CTA, some from this historic schedule data. We do some processing of it, and then some of it gets sent out to some of these data sets that you can download, and then some of it to the bus report cards to be able to kind of dig into it more on a web app. We only had a few months to work on this project, and I think there's so many things that we didn't get to and so much more that you could do with this data set. And so would love for folks to talk more about it. We have some ideas that we just want to like tell people about because we think they're really interesting and would love for someone else to look into it. One category of things is that one part of our process, and we can happy to talk more about this, is we took out a lot of weird data. We, through our cleaning, ended up keeping somewhere around like 98% of the original bus stops. So we found a lot of weird ones. We took out buses, for example, that said they were on a certain route, but the location was really far from where the route actually was. And so this could be due to construction, this could be due to bad data, things like that. And so I think there's an interesting question to ask, like, where is there bad data, where are buses not en route, and be able to dig more into those anomalies. The second one is using this to kind of think about and understand moments over time. There might be major construction plans. The Obama Center is being built right now in Hyde Park, and understanding how routes that go through construction areas are impacted. And so you can really use this data set to look at specific moments in time or events. There's also lots that we can do to think about like additional temporal spatial analysis that we could do. This is like understanding, how do we understand bus service on the weekend versus the weekday? We know that there's a lot of route changes, kind of understanding what impact there is, interpret areas where weekend service is cut across the city. And then the last one is there's lots of other data that we can combine and add this to. As Sarah's already said, you can kind of do it at the community area and understand different demographics and things like that. But I think there's lots of other ways that you can slice it and understand not only transit, but think about access to essential services, how far or how hard is it to get to a grocery store and a hospital based on bus routes from everywhere you are. And so I think there's lots of other supplemental data sets that you can add on and answer lots of interesting questions. This is kind of our quick run through, and we can jump into questions in a little bit, but just want to share this is fully open source GitHub repo with all of the data as well as all of the pipeline that's currently running. Everything's on there. This is the website to the dashboard as well that has the bus report cards that Joseph talked about, and then also an article to Sarah's amazing story. And so this is CTA StopWatch. And so thanks everyone for listening in, and excited to hear any questions y'all have.
Great. Thanks so much to our presenters for that presentation. And now we'd like to move into audience questions portion of the talk. And just to give a heads up that we have a bit of a special format this evening, wherein a lot of folks I think are joining remotely. And then we also have folks who are in person at Mansueto. So what we thought we'd do is give 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes or so to online questions, and then give the remaining of the time to tell over to folks who are there in person. So I encourage everyone who's online right now to pop your questions into the Zoom chat. And I'll get started with some questions for our presenters in the meantime. So first question is, among all the routes, buses, days of the week that you looked at in the data set, were there any particular routes out there or times of the week or regions that presented kind of unique challenges during the analysis? You mentioned some kind of weird data that popped up. I was wondering if there are any interesting things to talk about with particular regions or routes or times of day that presented weird data.
I can tell one story. Irene and I are laughing at each other. There was a video that we were sitting around over the summer of someone made a YouTube video of like the top 10 weirdest CTA routes. And I think as soon as we started, we were like, I know it's going to be #1. And we were correct. I'm forgetting the number, if it's the 168 or the 169, I'm forgetting. But there's a bus route that UPS basically pays for to transport basically from one location all of their employees. They pay the CTA to take them to the location for work. And so it's this really weird bus line that has basically like 2 or 3 stops, runs like 1 hour during the morning and then 1 hour during the evening. And a lot of the ways that we were calculating metrics was things around looking at, given a bus, when does the next bus come to that stop? And so it would be this weird thing where a bus would come like every 10 minutes and then all of a sudden another bus wouldn't come for 7 hours because they only ran it in these really weird times. And so this was one example of something that was a weird issue. Another one was, I think the 5-in is like a night bus. Part of this analysis, we only looked at buses that were running from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. to kind of capture the more normal time that our people are making it. So this was another bus that kind of goofed up our data because there was nothing really running during the day. And so that was one that was causing some issues as well.
And I think that speaks to the last part of like, where can we build on from here? And also like, this was discovered with some of the meetings with Sarah, that are we interested in the night schedules? Because like they're throwing all of the statistics off, right? The wait time didn't make like a lot of sense. If you are like analyzing the mean time of what's the waiting period, then you have night schedules that are supposed to run like every hour or so. So we had to do a lot of filtering to try to better capture how people that are maybe like using it for work or daytime activities are using it. But then there's a whole different conversation of what's the population that's being served at night, right? So I don't know.
And there's validity to looking into the night service, right? Because there's people, third shift workers, or people who just run errands at night, and who depend on buses, right? There are people who do depend on buses at night, and so there is a lot of validity to looking at that. And it was just one gap in our project because we can't do everything. So add that to the list of things to look into.
Sure, but the data is there, so like you can grab the data set and try to see through all the weirdness that's published.
Thanks. Another question that comes up is, we talked about some measures of service quality basically in one of the earlier slides, and we were wondering, was it obvious given the data that's there what kind of measures of quality you'd be able to craft with that data, or were there particular considerations you used when identifying the quality metrics that you were going to measure using the data?
Sure, no, I think it actually wasn't. Obviously, the technical part of imputing the time and getting like the timestamps down to the bus stop was the main technical challenge, but there was the other conceptual challenge of how are we going to define quality of service and what can we do with this data. So we performed some lead review to try to understand how academia and other people were thinking about this problem. And it turns out that measuring like accessibility and quality service actually needs much more information than the bus time, right? So for instance, how expensive it is, or how are you connected to other services? Because again, we were just analyzing the bus data information, but we know that people may use the bus to get to a train stop. So like mapping actually the whole network of public transit was much more complex than what we could achieve with just the bus stop data. There are also other questions of, okay, you are trying to reach hospitals or schools or your place of work. So how can we map, like we know where you can get in the city just using a bus, right? How long it will take you if you only use a bus to get there. But like, why are you interested in going to that part of the city, and where actually like, are you living? Which are these things that you're trying to do with the public transit system? So I feel like we needed to just try to think of statistics that will tell us something as a first step with just the actual performance and schedule data, right? Just like trying to have like a first step of, okay, this is the scheduled service. This is what it's supposed to be happening. And we can also like with that time, we can compare routes against routes, communities against communities, right? So we just like took that first step, but the question of accessibility, and Professor Bay is here, so I know that they can speak more about how you measure accessibility of public services. So I think that there's a whole world of things that we could do beyond what the project achieved.
Cool, thank you. Another audience question. So a unique aspect of this project is that there's analysts working together with the journalist. And the question is, what did Mansueto team and Sarah learn from each other's perspectives, coming in as journalists, coming in as analysts? Any advice for journalists trying to work with technical experts, or technical experts working with journalists?
No pressure, guys. Are we under the bus? No, I mean, I can start with that. So I guess as a journalist, I think very much in like kind of like real world application, like practical terms, which is helpful, but it's also like, I came in and I had this idea and I was like, I don't even know if you could do this. Like, I have no idea how this works or like what you need to get it done. So Definitely understanding, I still cannot do the technical data analysis, but understanding like what data goes into answering the questions I had was really valuable. And then hearing questions from you guys, from as you were looking through the data, you were just, I think, thinking about the whole issue of CTA service in a very different way than I was, which led to a lot of different questions on your end. And so kind of combining those two, different types of questions, I think we ended up with something that was really like practical and meaningful and helped make sense of a problem that we all knew was there, in a way that it just, with only one perspective, it wouldn't have quite gone that way.
Yeah, I think it was really nice. I think Sarah was so nice in having someone that we had to sit down weekly with and have like a North Star guiding light of being like, let's keep us, like there's so many rabbit holes, there's so many ways. This was such a huge data set. There were so many little technical, issues here and there. I think there would be weeks where we'd feel like we made so much progress, like, we have so much to do. And then we would start prepping to talk with Sarah the next day and we're like, we don't really need to tell her any of this, like none of this matters. We like found a weird bug and we've got like X more data and now we're like at this next step. And so I think being able to kind of work through challenges and then being able to understand how to like bubble that up to be like, okay, what are we actually getting out of this is useful to move us onto the project, and finding that balance of being able to dig into the really technical aspects, but never being able to get too far, because at the end of the week we had to come back and sit down at a table together and talk about what progress we made. And you can't pull up a screen of Python code or something like that. It's not gonna get us anywhere in a conversation, and shouldn't. So I think being able to have that balance felt really helpful.
And the whole idea is Sarah's, right? So you were the one that had the questions and the interest, and were like pointing us to what we will expect to see in the data, right? So we were like cross-referencing with you, like, does this make sense? Does this reflect what you've reported? Because you've been like reporting CTA performance or service quality for years, right? So we were just like kind of like getting into this data source. And as Austin mentioned, it's easy to just like find something that technically is interesting, but maybe it's not like as useful, or you don't need to go as technical to have something relevant to say. So I feel like also working with a journalist helped us to be grounded in what we wanted to achieve and what story we wanted to tell.
And like what's interesting, I think at times we'd be like, oh, this is so interesting. And so we'd be like, oh yeah, everyone knew that. Like, in a really good way, because I think it's helpful to kind of understand like, or even just validate like, oh, I think there were a lot of findings that we found where you're like, oh, this makes a lot of intuitive sense. And I think that's also a great thing to make sure we're on the right track.
And yeah, I would just add I think a really interesting way that I thought about this was hearing the data from you guys, and then actually just seeing how, like, did that line up with my own experience and for you guys too, right? You're all bus riders, I ride the bus. And so it was a little bit of like a fact check and a little bit of just like a fun kind of interesting thing was seeing this data, seeing how it played out, and then being like, oh yeah, like that totally lines up with my experience, or that doesn't line up with my experience. Why could that be? And of course, there's plenty of experiences out there in the city that are not ours. So not every experience lined up, but it was something that was actually just very cool about this particular project, was that you could kind of match it to your own experience.
Cool, thanks for that answer. And I do want to leave a space for questions for the in-person folks. Just before moving on, there's one last online question, and I want to see if there's a quick answer to this one. I know Sarah said that CTA claims they measure service differently, but did they take a look at the bus report card? Curious what the reaction was to what the data was showing.
So when I went to CTA, I think the report card website was not live, right? So I couldn't get them a link, but part of my reporting process is always to try to be really like transparent with whatever kind of agency I'm writing about like, here are the findings. I have questions about them. And so I tried my best to be as transparent as I could about some of these findings, and really like, give them numbers, give them data, explain. I spent a lot of time explaining actually how this data was reached, which was a fun, I had to come to understand what you guys did really well to be able to explain that to them. And one of the big takeaways that from CTA that I did put in the story was they talked a lot about how they measure service, which was really interesting. And what they told me was that they, if we were comparing neighborhoods to like demographics, like unemployment and income, and they said they track those things also, but they have, they classify their bus routes by like poverty routes or non-poverty routes. And that's based on some federal definitions. It's a, they didn't pull that out of nowhere. It actually is based in something. But what really struck me about it was that it goes by route, So I know two of the poverty routes that they mentioned where I should back up. They did say that they prioritized bringing back service on their routes that were considered poverty routes. So like, that's valid, makes sense. I have no reason not to believe that. But bus routes are long, right? And like two of the routes that they mentioned that are considered poverty routes are the Western Avenue bus and the Madison Avenue bus. And if you know anything about Western, it's like the longest street in the city. It runs literally not literally, almost from one end of the city to the other. And so that bus route, or the bus traveling along that route, goes through a lot of neighborhoods. And along that route, it's a long route. It's going to get stuck in traffic. So if you're up at the north end of the city and you hop on a southbound bus, it might be running on schedule. It might be, or it might, there just might be less traffic. And so they schedule it to come more often on the north side. And then by the time you get all the way down to the other end of the route, it's totally out of whack. Or it had to get through downtown. And so they had to add a bunch of time to the schedules to account for like traffic downtown. So these are all hypotheticals, but like it was just an interesting way, an interesting difference, I think, between how they told me they were considering, equity in bus service versus how we looked at it. And it, I think it just comes down to it's a judgment call, right? We made a judgment about what made sense to a rider. CTA made a judgment, and they weren't the same. So.
Thanks for that answer, and thanks for the online questions. Now I'd like to send it over to the in-person questions.
Okay. First of all, thank you for this work. It seems really incredible and really important all around. So my question is, there seems to be a lot of different axes within this data. It seems like a really rich data set. One example of like an axis that seemed important was it mentioned in the report that if you just looked at the scheduled time, you didn't really see a slowdown. But then if you looked at the actual time, that's when a lot of the significance started to play out. I'm curious if there's other maybe like variables or axes in the data set that you think you might have missed. And also like how you went about finding the significant features of the data set. Was there any kind of like communication or collaboration between the two different like the journalism and the technical side to find leads maybe in the data set?
Let me think about the first one. Maybe the second one is easier. I think we did the big chunk of the work was processing the data. I think there was a smaller chunk of the work of analysis. So I think what you said, there's a lot more here and a lot more to dig into. I think the lowest hanging fruit was that from Sarah's reporting and from the work, there was a lot of kind of anecdotal understanding of how service had changed or what had happened. And so I think there was a lot of stuff where at the beginning it was much more of like, we have this hypothesis, how can we then go to the data and ask the question of the data rather than starting with the data and trying to find what pulls out of interesting. And so I think we kind of landed on this understanding that this time till next bus was a really relevant metric to check, and we're able to kind of understand that over time. And we knew that there were big differences between what the schedule was saying versus what people's experiences was. The Ghost Bus project came out of kind of this idea that the actual buses were not actually coming and that schedules were way out of whack and weren't actually accurate to real-time buses. And so I think a lot of the analysis and a lot of what ended up coming into the story, and we have some appendix slides as well of some of this as well, is trying to take some of this understanding of what was happening from people on the ground and trying to then go and see if that's kind of supported in the data, and understanding that some of the big questions are around grouping it by community area, which really hadn't been done. And so kind of doing that as kind of the first pass of the analysis.
Yeah, and I feel like there's also, like as Austin mentioned, we had weekly meetings when we will reunite with Sarah and just tell her like, okay, we achieved this week, and then she will like guide us like make new questions about, okay, what's like the next step? And that's when we realized actually in this iterative process of like each week going back and forth with the data that we had, we discovered that there was like an actual improvement in the performance, but that was because the schedule had changed, right? So CTA was like, okay, I'm going to kind of like lower the expectations of what the amount of service that I'm going to provide is, like just like trying to get it to align with reality. So when you compare like the actual performance with the schedule, it actually improved because the schedule went back, right? And those were the kinds of things that we didn't know when we first took on the project. And then Sarah was like, yeah, I reported when they changed the schedule, right? So that this makes sense. So I guess like for this, those, as you mentioned, are the greatest access that we were seeing, like the actual performance, the schedule. But I think that maybe other things that we would like to see, as we also discussed, the time of the day, right? Time of the day, or maybe the day of the week that you're seeing the performance, because the behavior in a weekend is different for the weekdays, and the people that are being served by that are different. So that's something that you can see in our data. There are like other axes of analysis that you can look at. And then again, there's a whole different world of other variables that you could cross-reference our data with to see other stuff like how expensive it is to travel, right? The fare, or what's the other, like social demographic information that Sarah did incorporate in her reporting, right? So maybe that's a little bit of what you could try to see.
Yeah, I think the data we filtered out feels like a big pot of gold of like why is there data that we didn't use? Why was it not on route, and understanding where that was happening. And then maybe the other one small thing I'll add is like, I think we did a little bit of analysis of like, kind of to your point, like buses will often start on time because they leave at a certain point, but get really off track as they go. And so understanding like, where is that happening across cities? I think it's another piece, looking at the median of individual runs and trying to understand in which areas do buses get really off schedule, and then are there areas which they get back on schedule. So kind of that variation within a route could be interesting.
Where are the bottlenecks?
Yeah.
Are there ways that you see incorporating Metra and like rail into all of this?
That's my dream. I mean, I can't, I couldn't really, I don't know if this is true, but I suspect that, you know, the data is kept in very different ways. I suspect that would be a very big challenge. You know, one thing that actually made this project possible is that CTA like publishes all their data publicly, which is, I can't do much with it as a journalist, but it is pretty cool that it's out there publicly. And so getting comparable data from these other agencies would be challenging, although, you know, I frankly haven't looked into it a lot. It might actually be out there, so I shouldn't say never, but yeah, I would dream of doing that one day if it's possible. So stay tuned. I might be coming back to you guys.
Yes.
Look at some of this.
Yeah.
Other people doing it.
Like there's also the trains API from CTA, right? So that will be like a natural next step to try to incorporate where the CTA trains are going through and what's the service. We didn't look into that one because, as Sarah mentioned, they might be like maybe like easier to be on time, right? And you like these big avenues of like moving people around, but buses are much more fine-grained, and the service that they provide, they have like, maybe they provide the service to people that has no other alternative, and there's a lot of discussion on accessibility that goes through buses. I actually don't know if the Metra has an API as good as the CTA API, and that's like props to the CTA. As a CAP student, I actually did a project with Michael on the very same topic, CTA bus service, right? And we picked that project because there was data. And I feel like specifically in this moment where like some data sources, public data sources are being like taken away, speaks to the importance of just having access to the information so that we can measure the policies. And also, again, like props to the Ghost Bus project because they were archiving the data. And without them, this project wouldn't have been possible. So I think like there's a whole discussion on data accessibility, and we are looking into this in part because we have the data. So yeah, I will need to Google if there's like Metra information that we can incorporate.
I should add, there have been other like organizations that at various times have actually done exactly that in different ways. So one, Center for Neighborhood Technology, which is, you know, a local Chicago organization. They did actually map that out several years ago. So it's I believe it is not like current. They didn't build a pipeline like you guys did, but you know, and there's a transit kind of like think tank based in New York that puts out they do this for a bunch of cities, and including Chicago. So it's not, you know, it's not exactly what we looked at, but it's in various different ways it tries to answer the question you just asked, which is like, if you look at transit as a whole, if you look at CTA trains, CTA buses, Metra, Pace, how accessible, I think one thing I've seen done is how accessible are jobs via all these forms of transit. So yes.
And the other missing piece is ridership, right? We know that the bus was physically moving, but we don't know like how many people were in that bus or like who is using the service, which is not in the API, obviously.
Cool.
Actually,
So I
question
think
for
if there's one more in-person question, I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, a question for Sarah. I know that the census releases this variable that's percentage of population dependent on public transit. So I'm just wondering if that was an access that you were looking at in conjunction with this project or have looked at previously.
It is one that I'm familiar with. I actually didn't I didn't use it for this specific project because basically CTA has been examining its bus network, right, as we were also examining its bus network. And they brought in a consultant, and the consultant gave a public presentation that I listened to kind of like as this project was wrapping up. He was giving this presentation, and he ended up talking a lot about, again, like neighborhood demographics, kind of like I mentioned before, and mentioning, and CTA themselves have mentioned, right, the importance of kind of keeping track of like where service is running in relation to unemployment and access to jobs and income. And so I kind of followed CTA's lead on that, and I was like, well, if they're looking at these metrics, like I'm going to look at these metrics also. But I think that the census, you know, percentage of population that's transit dependent is a really interesting one. It's definitely worth looking at. One thing that is a little bit difficult about census data is accessing it in whatever like shape you're looking at. So like if it's citywide, if it's neighborhood, like it's all out there, but just like making sure you're looking at something that lines up with the like unit of geography that you're looking at. But yes, it is definitely worth keeping tabs on.
What? I apologize that we're a little bit late here, but I was just really happy that there's so many good questions coming in. So before we move on, the next section of our evening, I want to thank our presenters again. I want to thank them for their great work on this project and for the good presentation this evening.
And if there are any journalists tuned in right now, I just want to mention that we are currently accepting applications for our upcoming summer's data journalism program. So we'd love to hear what you might be inspired to look at.
And thanks to David, Eric, and Chris, who also provided a lot of support throughout all of the process. This wouldn't have been possible without their guidance. So thank you, and the full Mansueto team and family, and for Chai Hag Night for hosting us. So yeah, good night.
Thank you. So the folks on the call will now be transitioning to the civic tech portion of our evening. Please stand by for a minute or two as we make that transition.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much for participating in the breakout portion of Shy Hack Night tonight. I am going to share my screen. All right. So please feel free to start your video if you're so moved and come off of mute. We are going to start with 3-word intros. We're going to go through some of the announcements again and some of the rules of the road, and then we'll go right into our breakouts. So with that, let's do it. Let's do our 3-word intros. You introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns if you like, and 3 words, and then you hand it off to somebody else. So I will start. I'm Adam Heckman. He, him, his are my pronouns, and my 3 words are for good advisory, and I will pop it over to Kyle.
Hi, sorry, I was a bit distracted. I was trying to figure out how to allow everyone to show their video. So I'm Kyle, he, him pronouns. Gloomy weather today. And I would like to pass it on over to Howard.
You said Howard, correct?
Yes, yeah, sorry, I think folks are still unable to unmute themselves. So sorry, everyone, please stand by for a moment or two and figure out how to give you that permission. Actually, Adam, I might need your help to make Shy Hack Night the host.
All right, should work for folks now.
There we go. All right, Howard, you're up.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, Howard Kier, he, him, his. And my 3 words are looking for work. And I will pass it off to Ted.
Thanks, Howard. I'm Ted, he, him, exploring AI APIs. And I would pass it to Steve. I think you're on mute, Steve.
Steve, you're on mute.